Welcome to another episode of the BS Podcast, the show that looks at how behavioral change insights are being applied in the wild. Episodes feature renowned behavioral experts across industries and organizations, from management and marketing to policy and public health, and more. Let's dive in and see what all the BS is about. Here's your host from The Behaviorist, Nick Hobson.
Hello, BS listeners, and welcome back. This week marks the 1-year anniversary of my podcast, It's All Just a Bunch of BS. If you know me, you know I'm the type of person that tends not to reminisce or wax nostalgic about the past. My focus tends to be forward-looking, my gaze to the future, on projects or ideas that have the promise of what's to come. Now, that's not meant to be a humble brag, although it might sound like one. A mind like mine is a productive one, sure, but it's also a mind that forgets to savor the good, a mind that leaves little room for gratitude. So I guess this is me doing just that, being grateful and thinking back over the last year of all the fun I've had doing the show. 52 weeks, 52 episodes, 52 experts from a range of different industries, including marketing, communications, HR, design, product, finance, research, and policy, among others. I've been lucky enough to get the ear of some of the industry's leading thinkers and practitioners. You know, podcasting is a funny thing. Imagine reaching out to a world-class expert or a famed author or a renowned executive, asking them for an hour of their time just to ask them a bunch of random questions that you find interesting. Hey, so-and-so, you don't know me, but could I call you and ask some questions? They'd look at you like you have 3 heads. Why the hell would anyone agree to that? Now, tell them that you will record the episode, make it live, turn them into an animated cartoon GIF for cover art, and bam, you have a podcast guest. You have a podcast show. Okay, back to my moment of personal reflection and warm, fuzzy feelings of being thankful. Lest I bore you, dear reader and listener, with my own gratitude journaling. Trust me, nobody wants to read that. I figure the best thing I can do is let my guests do the talking. They are the interesting experts, the ones with something to say. The challenge, though, that lay before me was coming up with a way to present all the insights and experiences of my esteemed guests over the last year in one cohesive way without it being book length. Now, as pure dumb luck would have it, I actually have something I could use to organize this post and episode. It's almost as if I planned it since the very beginning. It's called the Big Behavioral Brainstorm, or the BBB. The BBB is the question I ask all my guests at the end of each episode. It goes like this. Of all the problems in the world today, which one would you say could stand to benefit from a behavioral-based solution? So now I have a standard response from all my guests on a single most important question with an even more important single answer. I really like the BBB question, as do most of my guests, I think. At the aggregate level, it reveals which core issues we care most about as a collective of professionals who, like all others, simply want things to be better for the future. And at the individual level, it reveals what one person who I'm interviewing values most in his or her work in life. As you'll see, the range in responses as well as the shared amount of overlap is quite striking and interesting. Okay, so the methods and results. I combed through all my past episodes and took note of each of the guests' answers to the BBB question. The results presented in time to come are the guest responses organized into their relevant themes. Within each theme, I highlight the key quotes and snippets based on what my guests had to say as part of their answer to the BBB. There are a series of written quotes and spoken quotes embedded in the post and in the episode, along with some other editorial useful information. Okay, all that to say, so what do the best behavioral scientists and psychologists in the world care most about in their response to the BBB? Let's have a look. So after some very simple data crunching and data analyses, I discovered there was a total of 8 possible categories. We have meaning, self-growth, topping out in the first the most popular sort of response to the BBB, accounting for nearly a quarter of all responses, followed by future of work, workplace engagement, next, inequality, poverty, next, climate change, after that, conflict communication, after that, science, then financial systems, and finally, coronavirus. So let's go through each one in turn and listen to what the experts had to say. Starting with meaning and self-growth. At its core, behavioral science is a science of the self. This makes it unlike any of our other sister scientific disciplines, but it is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's an intuitive appeal about our field and its findings. Any person off the street can read a lay-friendly summary of a psychology study and almost right away find it interesting or personally relevant. And yet, it's because of this basic understanding that our science is at risk of being confused with self-help pseudoscience. All the more reason, then, that behavioral science should be used correctly and responsibly in improving ourselves and our lives, be it achieving goals, breaking bad habits, or leading more meaningful and fulfilling lives. In reality, the science, our science, has a treasure trove of little and big insights to help a person's path towards self-growth. In episode 26 with Celia Vuma, she captures it in so few words. There is so much we can do to help people achieve their potential. When we say the word potential, the notion of goals comes straight to mind. Behavioral science and social psychology have a lot to say on the topic of goal setting. Rob Hasefield from episode 27 delivers on this train of thought. I think that behavioral science plays a very important role in helping people achieve their goals. Just imagine what would the world look like if they were better able to live up to their potential. There are so many goals that people have that they struggle with. And why do people struggle? As anyone can attest to, we are good at setting goals. We're not so good at following through on them. The so-called intention-action gap is a well-studied phenomenon in which a person can rather easily set a desired goal, but more than likely fail to deliver on the action in achieving that goal. We've all been there with a new workout regimen or a diet plan or whatever else. As Sam Seltzer from episode 6 puts it, so many good intentions go to waste. People don't have the tools or resources to translate it into sustainable action and change. For me, that's where I think the field can do great work for finding where the gap exists between intention and action. We're early stages now. A lot of the big behavioral problems can be stripped down to this intention-action gap. The domain of health is especially relevant here, I think. Olin Holsworth of Pattern Health argues that, quote, in healthcare, there's a huge gap between where we are now and where we could be. An enlightening number that I think about from time to time is the following. Individual behavior and people's everyday decision-making about what they eat or whether they take their medication and so on accounts for half of the $3.3 trillion of healthcare spending. People know they should eat well, be physically active, but they don't do it. The biggest opportunity is getting people from intention to action, and behavioral science is perfectly suited for that problem. For changing our own behaviors, humans tend to be of two minds. The goal-directed system, covered in the above, is only half of it. The other, our habit-based system, is the path to sustainable self-growth that allows us to efficiently and automatically engage in new behaviors or disrupt existing ones that are of value to us. Habits, we've come to understand, can be a more effective path to behavior change than conscious goal deliberation. To say it more plainly, we want our personal behavior changes to last. Habit, by definition, is something that is cued, reinforced, and routinized again and again and again. It is a holistic change that is long-lasting. Steve Wendell from Morningstar, this is episode 41, says, long-term change within people is the field's big blind spot. I don't think we have a fundamental understanding of where habits are fragile and where they are durable and where we can change people, not just the moments of action. When thinking of possible solutions, the area of behavioral design, and in particular the combination of technology and behavioral science, is beginning to show promise. Here we have Neri Al from episode 8, quote, I think one of our problems that is an age-old problem is, why do we do things against our better interest? Behaviorally informed technology can be an amazing tool to help us do the things we want to do but don't do for one reason or another. And in that vein, a word from Nate Undorsky on how we can do better, episode 18. When we're looking at applications and software that are built around helping people save money, eat healthier, work out more, a lot of them aren't built with a behavioral approach. There's a sprinkling of the science on top of the products afterwards. But if we can get to a place where it's built into the core of the product, it makes it that much more powerful. Still in the space of self-growth, but looking at it from a zoomed-out view, there's also the question of improving people's well-being and life satisfaction, particularly in our social lives. Carolyn Rue, episode 34 of McGill University, asks the basic question of keeping up with the Joneses. How do we counteract perceived scarcity and help people be more satisfied with what they have? Flying in the face of capitalism and marketing, we shouldn't be made to feel that we need more to feel happier. We should lead people to feel satisfied and more content with what they have. Germane to the topic of feeling satisfied is our collective call to feel more connected with others in our lives. Both Kristen Berman, episode 5 from Irrational Labs, and Oval Caesar, episode 49 from UNC Business School, make a clear statement about the pains of experiencing loneliness. Here's Kristen. I'm excited by the potential of behavioral science to help with connection, making friends and keeping friends, recognizing that a loneliness problem is probably a connection problem. If the environment has an outsized influence on our behavior, then I think our environments aren't conducive to making connection possible. Bars, even our homes. People are prioritizing countertops over relationships. And Oval on loneliness can be combated with a basic human kindness. Quote, I think we need to think about how to make people feel less lonely. Loneliness is a pandemic itself now more than ever. Is it possible to make people give a compliment to each other without any agenda? Do we use them enough to make people feel connected and make them feel like they matter? End quote. Next section, we cover on the future of work and engagement in the workplace. Work is changing. The so-called future of work is here. It's no longer the future. Technologies are making it easier for us to do business at a truly global scale and to reimagine our role within the marketplace and workplace. In episode 19, Christian Hunt's BBB hits this on the point. Quote, technology is moving really quickly, and the role of human beings is going to be very different down the road. In order for business to succeed, we need to get the most out of our people. We need to see them not as a resource, but as people. Ironically, however, new technologies can often impede our productivity and workplace wellness. In episode 36, Jason Collins' response was exactly on this. We need to help people at an individual level be more productive in their days, he says, to get more out of them from what they enjoy doing. Similarly, Richard Clayton from episode 28 warns us about the, quote, misguided perceptions of good work. The business as usual of many employees is being part of an endless email chain that amounts to nothing more than shallow work. As Richard continues, quote, you're not being paid to write emails. Good work looks like a period of the day when you're not being distracted. It looks like going into a room together to collaborate on a complex problem. It looks like social bonding, having a cup of coffee together. Related to this point, with these technologies comes the important work of human-machine interactions to ensure that our automated systems and processes are serving the greatest number of people being touched. In episode 21, Richard Chataway hits it right on the head. The relevance of behavioral science and automation is obvious. How do we deal with self-driving cars and mass unemployment? The so-called soft skills of empathy will be required. And if the push towards automation continues, and it will, the only jobs left for humans to do are those that by necessity have a psychological component. But with all this change comes great uncertainty. Lack of purpose and fulfillment in work is felt by many these days. Many of the guests' BBB is a clear call out for things to change, a hopeful message that people's workplace experiences can be better. Indeed, there's a growing demand for a redesign of a more human workplace. Experiences of compassionate leadership and human-centric work are the mainstream focus of big organizations like McKinsey, IKEA, Unilever, Lego, and others. In episode 39, Julia Darr of Boston Consulting Group says, "Most Americans are disengaged at work and many of those people hate what they do, but it doesn't have to be. Such a problem is ripe for a behavioral intervention." Similarly, in episode 22, Charlotte Blank, CBO of Merits, sees a need for us as behavioral practitioners to do more internally with organizations and employees. She says, "Almost no one is doing behavioral science in an employee and organizational context. What needs to happen is taking the evidence-based thinking that you see with consumers and shining that lens internally towards employees." Tim Kachuriak from episode 30 asks such a simple but profound question. Quote, "Imagine what business would look like if employees really cared. Is there some truth that transcends all behavior for getting people to care?" And Matai Suka from the very recent episode 50 calls out in a slightly different way. "The world would be a far happier place if most people were happy at work." He goes on to say, quote, "There's a huge problem throughout the world that the majority of people go to work sad, disengaged. From the moment they swipe in, they start the countdown for when it's time to leave and go home. I think behavioral sciences can have a lot to say about what's driving motivation and engagement. Not only can the future of work help us to be engaged at work, it can help us be more fulfilled in our life, generally. In my own reverse interview of episode 35, I call out a general lack of meaning in people's lives and that the workplace is well suited to change that. I say, we are in a meaning pandemic. We see that as evidenced by the surge in mental health issues, with the growing prevalence of anxiety, mood disorders, depression, and suicide. Despite being the richest and the most technologically advanced we've ever been, we're experiencing a psychological crisis. And with this meaning void, we're not filling because of a failure to adapt or adopt our parents' and grandparents' religions. Where do we go to fill that void? I believe some of that can be found in work. The last word on this BBB theme of workplace engagement and the future of work goes to Guy Champness from episode 7. Workplace and business impact will begin to extend beyond shareholder returns. Purpose-oriented organizations will alter the landscape of employee and organizational life. And it is a distinctly behavioral phenomenon. Guy says, "There's a push for purpose in business. With the inadequacy of governments around the world to operate, people are looking to business to step up. They have the sheer scale to step in and be a force for good. Peter Drucker said, every social problem that faces us is a business opportunity in disguise. This is more relevant than ever before. And behavioral science and business is right in the middle of that because it can be the boots on the ground and the envoy to the top of the company who are driving not just shareholder value, but value for all." Moving on to our next section, covering on the BBB, inequality and poverty. The events of the last year have laid bare the many injustices of our society. Growing disparities in wealth can and should be viewed through a behavioral lens. It's people at the end of the day that are involved in these exchanges. And while these problems have existed for decades and millennia, having a dedicated field of applied science positions us, our organizations and institutions and governments, to act and make change. Stephanie Johnson from episode 40 cuts right to the core of the issue. She says, "It's a problem that can be solved by understanding people's psychology and motives. Our organizations should turn to evidence-based practices to facilitate actual change." Lindsey Kohler, episode 47, echoes my opening lines about it feeling especially relevant right now with COVID and social injustices spurring collective action. She says, "The issue of fairness and inequality has always been there, but COVID and Black Lives Matter has catapulted that into the conversation and exposed it in a way that we can no longer ignore it. It was exposed in workplaces during COVID of who has the privilege to stay home and maintain their paid position versus those who have to risk going out there on the front lines to do their work." And as Stephen Wendell from episode 41 says, right now feels like the time to do something about it. Quote, Systemic inequality, thankfully, the US is starting to pay attention to more broadly in the media. I hope that as behavioral scientists, we can take on these problems. The attention on these problems is there from the media and general public, as Stephen pointed out. It is probably one of the most difficult but important problems of our time, as Mike Norton from Harvard Business School suggests. Here's Mike's response to the BBB from the show's very first episode. Quote, "Yes, most people aren't comfortable with how unequal things are right now. Behavioral science can better document the effects of inequality on the outcomes that most people care about. It's not low-hanging fruit. It's very difficult research to do. But in the least, showing that inequality can have these negative market effects can influence and guide policy to see improvements." When thinking about the issues of inequality, you see poverty and its endless cycle of intergenerational oppression at the core. Cass Sunstein of Harvard, episode 33, cites research that looks at how and why people who experience poverty will benefit from a series of well thought out and empirically informed social supports. He says, "If you're poor, the number of things you can attend to isn't as high as if you have the resources. It's a bandwidth problem. Governments need to go in this direction for helping people who are poor to make education, healthcare, work readily available so they can be granted equal access as their less poor counterparts." Strides are being taken. The work is getting done. As Ali Fenwick, episode 23, says, there is small wins to celebrate. He says, quote, "The work of behavioral science being applied in developing countries is a major area to use for good, to help improve well-being, health, and happiness of global citizens. And intervention-based work is also showing success." This is what Michael Sanders had to say in response to the BBB, going back to episode 2. "How do we help people coming out of prison and divert them away from reoffending, recognizing that most of the time, many of the people didn't want to reoffend? A well-thought-through detailed intervention have proven to work in mitigating that behavior. In particular, violence by men on women is a huge creator of inequality, and a serious amount of work could help reduce that inequality." The next section is on climate change. In the last couple of years, the problem of climate change has gone from a distant warning to a global emergency. It is quickly becoming, according to the scientific community, an all-hands-on-deck type situation. We need smart minds to come together and find a solution, and to do it quick. The experts all say that behavioral scientists ought to be a part of joining that group effort. Torben Emmerling of Affective Advisory, back from episode 37, says, "Our field has the support for encouraging pro-environmental behaviors and to stimulate a mindset change that could potentially save millions of people." Similarly, Sam Tatum, episode 12, outlines, quote, "The climate emergency is a territory that is ripe for behavioral science. Informing and framing the challenge, like for instance calling it a climate emergency, is how we can motivate individuals to take action. There exists the perception that the actions of a single individual making any real difference is a drop in the ocean. If there's anything that behavioral science has taught us, it's that small changes can have huge lasting effects. And additionally, that people can be motivated to change their behaviors through various social-based interventions. Bob Cialdini, the master of influence, says that, quote, "For the last 3 decades, I've been trying to understand the social influence process in the context of environmentally sound and protected ways." Behavioral science also knows that scaling up behavior change can be incredibly effective when done at the level of policy. Josh Wright of Ideas 42, episode 9, brings in both elements. He says, "Behavioral science has been used a lot related to climate change on getting individuals to change their behavior as the end consumer. But I think for us to address climate change, there needs to be a bigger policy and structural changes. How do you get humans to vote differently to select the candidates who will help increase the seriousness of climate change?" Dilip Soman and Rotman School of Management, episode 3, echoes that sentiment, but within the operational policies of large-scale organizations. He says, "I think there's a heck of a lot more could be done in influencing the behavior of corporations. How can we get a company to have less plastic in their packaging, as one example? Thinking outside the nudging of end consumers, what incentives can we think of for businesses that are likely to help with reducing our impact on the climate?" The last word here goes to Matt Wallert from episode 4. Yes, behavioral science will have to cover both areas of change, the individual and the collective, to effect swift positive change with the climate crisis. He says, individual agentic action can play a key role. That said, regulation, legal, and cultural change is also required on top of the collective actions of individuals. My hope is, as hard as we are working on the individual side, there's also work on the collective side. And with both, we'll get the job done. Our next section is moving to conflict and communication, the divisiveness of our global society. Our societies, both local and global, seem rife with conflict. Political divides, cultural wars, and the othering of outsiders has led to a certain loss of humanity, and made worse, no doubt, by social media. Quote, politics are at a point of breaking, says Mickey Inslicht from episode 24. Could behavioral scientists work on solutions that are useful or helpful? Well, we certainly hope so, but there are some obstacles to overcome that seem at times almost insurmountable. Rima Tepper from RBC episode 16 forces us to think what is possible of behavioral science in this area. She says, the political divide we see in the world stems from emotional mindsets, but the requirements to change people's minds is very difficult, and we have to remember to go for the easy wins, the things that require you to change people's behaviors instead of their minds. We recognize the difficulties knowing that behavioral science may be able to do something about maintaining the integrity of a free, open, democratic society. Keeping the foundations of a functioning government and media will rely on the work of behavioral insights, says Mariel Beasley of Common Sense Lab in episode 11. The solution, some believe, lies in the communication and the willingness to experience a reality outside of one's own comfort zone. In episode 26, Celia Vuoma comments, quote, there's so much suffering in the world from insensitive communication. People who aren't very aware of themselves leads to far too much collateral damage to people who don't deserve it. The refugee crises around the world, for instance, are a shame on humanity, and behavioral science could have a huge impact there. Steve Martin from Influence at Work, episode 48, on convincing others to be open to change. He says, how do you persuade people to be a little bit more open-minded? We've become overly tribal, and as a result, there are all sorts of unintended consequences. Affecting change in people to have them to be more open, accepting, and emotionally and socially aware is the job of a behavioral scientist and psychologist. Nancy Duarte from Duarte Inc. ends us on a note of optimistic reflection. She says, imagine a world where millions and millions of people are strong communicators. That's the world I want to live in. Our next section is on science, the use of science, the usefulness of science, and innovative thinking. Science is an amazing system of understanding the world around us and within us. Amazingly, it's still in its infancy when you think of the broader evolutionary timeline of the human species. Yet in such a short period doing science, and by that I mean the communal acquiring and communicating of knowledge, has made it possible for incredible technological advancements. When done right, science has the ability to solve for many of the problems we face currently. As Aaron Halliday from episode 25 puts it, if people understood what science actually is, how it's done, how to properly evaluate good evidence from bad evidence, a staggering number of problems in the world would cease to be a challenge. If people had the tools like answering and asking questions effectively, which is what science is, these problems would resolve themselves. Following on that note, Lauren Waldman, episode 42, says that, quote, if there's ever a time to change on how we learn with all the knowledge of the science that we have, it's now. The distinguishing element of science is how it's carried out to arrive at an answer to a particular question, namely maintaining a level of objectivity. In his answer to the BBB, Stuart King from episode 17 points out that, quote, the Nobel Prizes nowadays are won by multidisciplinary teams. They succeed because a lack of shared blind spots means you don't fall into groupthink. By using data and ideas from people of all kinds of different industries, you can find really interesting outcomes and not presupposing anything along the way. Rory Sutherland of Ogilvy UK, episode 32, calls out that much of what we struggle with as a global human population can be boiled down to what he calls metrics. He continues, almost all the units of measurement or metrics we use in business and government bear almost no relation to the creation of human well-being. What if we had psychological or behavioral units instead? What is the SI unit of regret, of uncertainty, of irritation? The basis of all science, including behavioral science, is just that, measurement. To Rory's point, being able to define and operationalize these important psychological and behavioral constructs would mean we could use the tools of science in an accurate way. And by doing so, help design, manage, and optimize for maximal human flourishing. Our second last section on financial improvements. In looking at the various problems we face as global human citizens, money and finances is often the primary variable that has knock-on effects for other deleterious outcomes, including inequality, poverty, conflict, and other socio-political problems. As Mariel Beasley, episode 11, points out, quote, finance is a space that percolates to everywhere else in our lives. Financial stress is one of the biggest sources of stress. It leads to poor health and educational outcomes and leads to undue conflict within families and communities. Behavioral finance is a promising subfield within the applied behavioral sciences space that sees a need for change. That change, the experts believe, will be born out of the necessary innovations of financial institutions to make people's money work for them in the best possible way. But as Greg Davies from episode 44 points out, we need to be smart about it. He says, we keep throwing nudges at financial well-being and throwing them in the wrong direction. What we need to focus on is helping to build financial systems, to stop focusing on selling people financial products, but instead an ecosystem that has sensible flows. The future of work and financial planning is drastically different than what it was even a decade ago. The gig economy and changing landscape of the global workforce requires a shift in how people plan. Jez Groom from Cowrie Consulting in episode 13 elaborates on this point. He says, I don't believe a passive relationship with your pension for 30 years is a good plan for everyone. People now have many jobs and employers in their lives, and life can increasingly take unforeseen twists and turns. Plans need to be changed accordingly. Getting people to get into the habit at least once a year to review their future plans could help people change their behavior for the better. Our final category, our final theme for this 1 year in a review episode is dealing with the coronavirus. There are two experts here who have something to say. Many people across the globe, though certainly not all, have been heeding the advice of the scientific community and what they have to say about COVID-19. That includes the professional research epidemiologists, immunologists, and the like, but also us, the behavioral scientists, the behavioral practitioners. It's no surprise, really. The success of the virus's contagion depends almost entirely on the behaviors of its hosts, human beings. April Vellacott from episode 29 and Wendy Wood, episode 31, echo that same sentiment when it comes to the role that we as human beings can play in mitigating the spread. Here's what April says. Almost all of the problems with the spread of COVID-19 is behaviorally related. Social distancing is a bad frame to use for a positive behavior we want to encourage. Maybe we should instead be calling it distant socializing. That's one small example. The list feels endless for where behavioral science could be used to save lives right now. And here's what Wendy Wood had to say. We know that so much of the contagion depends on human behavior. It depends on whether we wear masks, whether we stay 6 feet apart. All of those can become habits easily if we practice them. This contagion could be mitigated to a great extent through people's habits. And in that vein, it's hard to think of any social problem, for that matter, that's not in some way linked to our habits. So there you have it, friends. Some of the field's top behavioral scientists discussing what we could do to help solve some of the world's most intractable issues. But let's be clear, behavioral science is no panacea. It is just one other way to solve complex problems and answer difficult questions. In our early days as a profession, we've gotten quick wins, and that's good. There's some attention that's being put on us. To continue to stay relevant, though, and to continue to deliver on the promises of our scientific integrity, we need to work on big issues like these, and we need to be open for cross-collaboration and to learn from all those other disciplines. That is human ingenuity at its finest. And so, it's all just a bunch of BS, and I couldn't be happier about it. Thanks for listening. And remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful. Hey, Nick here once more. A final farewell note before ending. All the show notes, links to papers, resources, and materials mentioned in this episode can be found on the BS podcast page of The Behaviorist, where you can find all episodes and lots of other interesting and easy to apply sciencey stuff. Just head on over to www.behaviorist.biz/BS podcast. The show is edited and co-produced by Laura Christine and Noelle Rain, and visual artwork, banners, and animated GIFs created by the talented Iris Deng of dengit.org. That's DENGIT.org. Definitely go and check it out. Lastly, if you'd like to join me in the mission of spreading the good BS word, remember to rate and review the show on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcast fix. Quite a bit of work goes into these episodes, and a little love would go a long way. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, remember, keep your facts ugly and your hypotheses beautiful.